Hello, I'm the masked amp. I've got a mask and I'm an amp. One Monday morning in the early autumn of 1976, I turned up for work at Charwood Social Services Department, along with 3 other people who had also succeeded in getting jobs as unqualified social workers in Charwood. Social services functioned very differently 45 years ago. In 1974, only 2 years before I started work as a social worker, there had been a huge national reorganisation of social care provision, precipitated by the Local Authority Social Services Act 1970. This in turn had been inspired by the Seebohm Report, published in July 1968, which had proposed the integration of disparate social care services into single generic departments overseen by local authority social services departments. Until then, social care had been administered in a range of disguises, or guises even. For example, mental health had mental welfare officers, defined by the Mental Health Act 1959. Services for children and families had children's officers. Hospital social work was done by Hospital Almoners. In 1974, all these people were moved into these generic departments and all became known as social workers. Most of the people already working in Charwood area office had come from these areas. Most of them either had no formal qualifications or had qualifications in their specialist areas. Some had letters of recognition, which formalised their previous experience and recognised their competence to practice as social workers. When I started, there were only 1 or 2 staff in the entire team of more than 20 who had actually formally trained and qualified as social workers. The area office covered a population of around 40,000 and dealt with everybody in the community who had a social care need. Children and families, people with mental illness, people with learning difficulties, who were then known as mentally handicapped, people with physical disabilities, older people, and people with sensory impairment, although they were then formally known as blind, partially sighted, or deaf. As a generic social worker, I was expected to have a caseload with a mixture of all these people. We had comparatively little to do in the first couple of days. We had a brief induction process to explain administrative procedures, the filing system, methods of recording, and so on. The expectation was that all contacts with service users would be written by hand and then given to the large team of typists, who would then type it onto contact sheets, which would then be filed. Within a couple of days, however, I was sitting in with the duty officer, whose job it was to take any calls relating to inquiries or requests for services from any source, and to see and interview anyone who walked into the department requesting help. After a morning of this, during which I sat in on several interviews, ranging from a request to have a home help for an elderly relative, to a young mother saying that she couldn't cope anymore and wanted her children taken into care. The social worker then decided I had accumulated enough experience to field a call, and the next time the phone rang, she told me to answer it. My bowels immediately turned to water. I broke into a sweat as my shaking hand reached for the ringing phone. Everything suddenly seemed to go into slow motion. "Hello, can I help you?" I asked with a quavering voice. Thankfully, it wasn't a service user. It was a doctor asking for one of his elderly patients to be assessed for Part 3 accommodation. I had picked up in the previous couple of days that Part 3 accommodation meant a local authority old people's home, so that didn't faze me. I took down the details of the person and told the doctor we would arrange to see her. I had successfully managed my first duty call. Charwood Social Services catchment was very varied. It covered a geographical area about 20 miles in diameter, which included Charwood, as well as a couple of small market towns and a lot of villages. About half the population lived in the villages and small towns, and the rest lived in Charwood. The main problems for people outside Charwood related to age and infirmity. Charwood itself, however, was quite different. In the 1960s through until the late 1970s, the Greater London Council embarked on a massive social housing building programme in existing towns outside London, as well as encouraging the creation of new towns such as Milton Keynes. Businesses were encouraged to relocate to these towns, taking their employees with them. Charwood was one of these London overspill towns. It meant that Charwood had a very unusual demography for the predominantly rural county. Charwood had increased in size from a population of about 4,000 in the 1950s to approaching 20,000 by the mid-1970s. Most of this increase consisted of families with children who had all moved from the London area and who all had jobs in the relocated light industries, since the requirements for obtaining one of the new GLC houses was that you had to live in a London borough and you had to have a job in Charwood. Since I met these requirements, I was entitled to one of these houses, and for the first year I lived on one of the largest of the new GLC housing estates. As Charwood Social Services Department was in the old site office of that estate, I didn't have far to go to get to work. If you're interested, I'll tell you about my first caseload in future videos. Well, if you have been, thank you for watching. If you found any of my videos entertaining or informative, please like and subscribe.